In the cold early months of 1945, as the German army staggered backward on every front, the men of the Waffenamt, the German Army Weapons Office, continued their work with the same precision and discipline they had maintained since the first days of the war. Bombs shook Berlin. Fuel was scarce. Factories were silent ruins. Yet deep inside underground workshops and commandeered school buildings, German engineers still analyzed every enemy weapon they could get their hands on. Rifles, pistols, tank sights, radios. American equipment arrived in crates marked with the dirt and grime of Ardennes snow and the smoke of burning towns along the Rhine. Most of the items were familiar or already cataloged. Grands, Thompsons, BARs, even the occasional Browning automatic rifle that had survived long enough in battle to be captured. But late in January, a small collection of weapons pulled from fallen American paratroopers reached a testing station outside Magdeburg. Among them lay a rifle that looked ordinary at first glance, almost identical to the M2 Carbine German engineers had been studying since Normandy. Same size, same wooden stock, same modest barrel, same light weight. But when the examiners inspected the fire control group, they froze. This carbine had a selector switch, a full automatic mode, something the original carbine had never possessed. A thin patterned stock marking revealed its purpose: M2. Until that moment, almost no one in the German weapons office had seen one. Reports from the Ardennes had mentioned a new American automatic rifle, very light, very fast firing, carried by paratroopers and scouts. Most officers dismissed the stories as battlefield exaggeration, but now the weapon lay on a steel table under a single hanging lamp, and its significance was immediately obvious. One engineer leaned in close and studied the internal parts. Another tested the selector. A third shook his head slowly as he examined the stamped components. It was not just a modified M1, it was something different. A new machine gun class entirely. In a drafty room with walls covered in ballistic charts, a senior engineer named Oberingenieur Martin Schwab flipped through notes and stared at the weapon as if it contradicted everything he thought he knew about American doctrine. The United States had always favored full-power rifles. That was why the Garand existed. That was why the BAR remained in service. Yet here in his hands was a weapon that deliberately abandoned the traditional approach. It was not a full rifle. It was not a submachine gun. It was something in the empty space between. Schwab wrote the first assessment that afternoon. American forces now deploy a selective fire light rifle, operating between the roles of the machine pistole and the Sturmgewehr. This is unexpected. His colleagues fired the weapon on a snow-covered range behind the building. The M2 spit out rounds at more than 700 per minute. Light recoil, surprising controllability, and accuracy at distances the MP40 could not reach. The wooden stock absorbed vibration. The weapon stayed on target with short bursts. A soldier could fire it one-handed if needed. The Germans looked at one another, stunned. One of them said softly, "This is too light to do what it does." They tested the magazines, 30-round versions, rare in American forces earlier in the war. They studied the machining, simple, clean, easy to mass produce. They inspected the gas piston, short stroke, reliable, and almost impossible to foul. Even in the bitter German winter, the weapon ran smoothly. A major in the weapons office scribbled a note in his evaluation: "The Americans have built the weapon our reconnaissance troops have always needed." That line would pass through multiple desks, copied and filed, while bombs shook the city outside. For years, German reconnaissance units had complained that the MP40 lacked range and penetration. The Kar 98K was too slow and too long. The STG-44, though powerful, was heavy and difficult to carry on long patrols. The gap had always existed, but Germany lacked the industrial stability to fill it. Yet the Americans, seemingly without planning, had filled the gap perfectly. As the German staff continued their examination, they realized something even more unsettling. The M2 was not a desperate late-war creation like many German weapons. It was not a prototype. It was not a last-minute innovation. It was simply an evolution of a rifle the Americans had mass-produced by the millions. Adding a full auto mode had created an entirely new battlefield tool with almost no new training required and no new logistics burden. At a time when Germany struggled to produce enough steel for replacement barrels and could no longer rely on stable factories, America had upgraded a lightweight carbine into something approaching a modern assault weapon. That realization lingered heavily in the testing room. A country crushed by fuel shortages and strategic collapse was now studying a weapon its enemy could produce by the crate. Schwab wrote one final line at the bottom of his report as Allied artillery rumbled faintly in the distance. They have built the first true, light assault carbine. We must understand this weapon. We are too late to copy it, but we must understand it. The men in that dim room knew the war was ending. They also knew they had just witnessed the birth of a new category of weapon, not German, not Russian, not British, but American. And it was only the beginning.
When the first firing tests of the captured M2 Carbine were completed, German engineers gathered in a cramped analysis room to study ballistic logs and mechanical sketches pinned across the walls. These were men who had dissected every modern weapon of the war, from the Tokarev rifles of the Red Army to the Browning machine guns taken from wrecked American bombers. They thought they had seen every possible category of small arms. Yet what lay before them on the table defied every classification they had used for decades. The German system divided weapons into clear roles. There were bolt-action rifles for long-range accuracy, like the Kar 98K. There were submachine guns for close-range bursts, like the MP40. And now there was the Sturmgewehr 44, the world's first fully realized assault rifle, which bridged the gap between rifle and SMG by using an intermediate cartridge. But the Americans, without developing a true intermediate round, had still managed to step into the same conceptual space with the M2 Carbine. It was neither rifle nor submachine gun. It was something in the middle, a weapon born not from theory, but from sheer practicality. The engineers began their assessment with weight. At barely 5.5 pounds, the M2 was astonishingly light, lighter than the MP40 by nearly a full kilogram, lighter than the Sturmgewehr 44 by almost 2, light enough to carry all day without fatigue. One engineer noted dryly that German soldiers often threw away equipment to keep pace on marches, while the Americans seemed able to issue a carbine so light that it added no burden at all. Next came the rate of fire. On automatic, the M2 cycled at over 700 rounds per minute, faster than the MP40 and approaching the cyclic rates of compact machine pistols. But unlike a typical SMG, the M2 remained controllable thanks to its balanced action and gas system. Short bursts stayed on target instead of climbing wildly. The engineers fired it from standing, kneeling, and even while walking. The weapon behaved more like a tamed automatic rifle than a typical machine pistol. They measured effective range. This was where the M2 surprised them most. The .30 carbine cartridge did not match the raw power of the German 7.92 rounds or the intermediate 7.92 Kurz round used in the Sturmgewehr 44, but it outranged the 9mm of the MP40 decisively. Where the MP40 fell off at 100 meters, the M2 remained accurate and dangerous at 200 or more. German examiners fired it against steel plates and noted with unease that the lightweight round penetrated surprisingly well at mid-range. It could defeat helmets at distances where the MP40 failed entirely. This brought the engineers to the most uncomfortable realization. The Americans had created a weapon that did not fit any known German doctrine, but solved multiple problems the German army had struggled with for years. They wrote down advantages in quick succession. Light enough for long-range patrols, fast enough for close-quarter fighting, accurate enough for medium-range engagements, simple enough for mass production, cheap enough for millions of copies, and with a magazine system that allowed rapid reloads and high sustained fire. One engineer summed it plainly: the Americans built the assault weapon without the assault cartridge. The Germans examined the internal mechanism next. The short-stroke gas piston perfected by David Marshall Williams fascinated them. It was simple, efficient, and rugged. It delivered reliable cycling even in cold weather, something the MP40 often struggled with. The trigger group, with its clever addition of a disconnector and selector lever, allowed effortless transition between semi-automatic and full automatic fire. Unlike the Sturmgewehr 44, the M2 could be built with far less machining and fewer complex stamped parts. A senior German armorer stepped back from the rifle and said,
almost reluctantly, "They have made something we could build only in experiments." The Germans were also impressed by the 30-round magazine. Their own MP-44 used a large and heavy magazine that soldiers often complained was awkward and prone to damage. The M2's magazine was lighter, easier to handle, and fast to change. In field tests conducted behind the lines, German evaluators found that a trained soldier could deliver extremely rapid fire, emptying 2 magazines in controlled bursts faster than an MP-40 gunner could reload a single stick mag. The next observation cut deeply. While the Sturmgewehr 44 was a breakthrough weapon, it was heavy, costly, and complicated. Even under the best conditions, Germany struggled to produce enough of them. By contrast, the M2's design was almost shockingly straightforward. The Germans described it as manufactured like a typewriter, but deadly as a machine pistol. It was a weapon designed not just for elite troops, but for mass issue. German examiners began writing doctrinal notes comparing the M2 to their own weapons. Against the MP-40, the M2 outclassed it in range, accuracy, reload speed, and mobility. Against the Kar-98K, it delivered far greater volume of fire and much faster reaction speed. Against the Sturmgewehr 44, it was lighter, simpler, and easier to carry on long marches, though less powerful. But in the hands of reconnaissance troops, the balance shifted sharply in the M2's favor. Reconnaissance units needed speed above all else. They needed to fire fast, short bursts and then disappear. They needed a weapon that would not slow them during long patrols. One engineer pointed at the M2 and said, "Our reconnaissance units have long asked for a weapon of this exact nature. We never gave it to them. The Americans did." The truth settled over the Waffenamt in a way no propaganda could soften. The M2 Carbine was not the most powerful weapon on the battlefield. It was not the most innovative, but it was among the most practical weapons ever issued in the war. It embraced mobility, speed, and volume of fire in a lightweight package that made it perfect for modern maneuver warfare.
When the German engineers finished their mechanical examination of the M2 Carbine, they moved on to a more important question. Not what the weapon was, but what it meant. Weapons were built for battlefield roles, and every role explained a philosophy. The Germans had invested tremendous effort into perfecting weapons for stormtroops, machine gun teams, and infantry riflemen, but there was one group that had always struggled with every weapon Germany issued: reconnaissance units. German recon troops were expected to do the impossible almost every day of the war. They were the eyes of the army. They moved far ahead of the main force. They crept through forests that hid entire enemy regiments. They skirted roads watched by snipers. They slipped behind towns lit only by burning rubble. They had to be fast, silent, and brutally efficient when contact came. Their lives depended on moving quickly and shooting faster. But the German weapons they carried were constant compromises that frustrated their mission. The Kar-98K was accurate but long and slow. The MP-40 was compact but lacked the range they needed when scouting across open ground or engaging at 200 meters. The Sturmgewehr 44 was powerful but too heavy for men who marched miles per day and often returned to base completely exhausted. The recon problem had never been solved, and in the M2 Carbine, German examiners suddenly realized they were holding the weapon that would have solved it perfectly. They began listing qualities that matched reconnaissance doctrine almost too well. Lightweight. The entire carbine weighed less than many German mess kits. Recon patrols often covered 10 to 20 kilometers in a single day. Saving 2 kilos of weapon weight mattered. It meant the difference between stealth and fatigue, between life and death. Fast handling. The M2 could be brought to the shoulder instantly. Recon troops needed to snap fire the moment a shadow moved behind a hedgerow. The carbine's small size and low recoil meant they could fire before an MP-40 gunner even got his weapon up. Mid-range effectiveness. Recon patrols rarely fought long battles. They fought seconds-long firefights at 50 to 200 meters. Too far for a pistol, too close for a slow cycling bolt action. Perfectly matched to the carbine's strengths. Controlled automatic fire. The M2's full auto fire was not meant to replace the firepower of a machine gun. It was meant for bursts, 3 to 5 rounds, quick,
sharp, aggressive. Enough to shock an enemy patrol or disengage from danger. German recon units had begged for exactly that kind of firepower since 1941. They never received it. The engineers held field tests to understand how recon troops would have used the M2. They sent veteran scouts and armored car crews into the woods outside Magdeburg, armed with the captured carbine. The reactions were immediate and unanimous. One scout lifted the M2 to his shoulder, fired a burst at a distant target, and lowered the weapon with a look of disbelief. "It is like carrying a pistol," he said, "but it shoots like a rifle." Another scout ran a short patrol course through rough ground and declared that for the first time he felt unburdened by his weapon. He could crawl, sprint, and climb without fighting the rifle the entire time. The carbine simply followed his body instead of resisting it. An armored car commander tested firing from inside his SDK-FZ222 turret. The M2 easily maneuvered inside the cramped compartment. The STG-44 had always been impossible to use in that space. The MP-40 required awkward contorting. The M2 fit naturally. He wrote in his report, "This is the weapon we should have had from the beginning." The Germans also examined the psychological effect. Reconnaissance troops needed confidence in their equipment more than any other soldier. When operating ahead of friendly lines, sometimes completely alone, a heavy weapon could feel like a liability and a slow weapon like a death sentence. The carbine inspired a sense of readiness, a sense that the soldier could fight or flee or fire accurately without delay. That emotional factor could not be quantified on charts, but every soldier who handled the M2 felt it immediately. Back in the analysis room, the engineers recognized the uncomfortable truth. Germany had created the first true assault rifle with the STG-44, but they had not created the light automatic weapon that recon units desperately needed. Their focus had been on replacing the infantry rifle. The Americans, without intending to, had created a reconnaissance weapon. The M2's simplicity also stunned the Germans. It required almost no maintenance. The gas system resisted fouling, the bolts stayed clean longer than comparable German designs. Even in cold weather conditions, it cycled reliably. The recon units operating on the Eastern Front would have killed for a weapon that still fired reliably at 30 degrees below zero. The M2 Carbine could have filled that role with ease. One engineer wrote a line in his field notebook that summed up the mood. "The Americans did not design this for reconnaissance, but it is perfect for reconnaissance." That was perhaps the hardest pill to swallow. The Americans had not intended to build a new class of weapon. They had simply upgraded a mass-produced, lightweight carbine, and yet the result was a weapon that solved a problem the Germans had wrestled with for years. The final blow to German pride came when they considered what would happen if entire U.S. recon battalions were equipped with M2 carbines. The engineers calculated that such units could strike with higher speed, overwhelm enemy scouts faster, and disengage more cleanly. They imagined American cavalry units, armored reconnaissance teams, and airborne scouts using the M2 in coordinated operations. The conclusion was chilling. In reconnaissance doctrine, this weapon gives them a decisive advantage. As a thin layer of snow began falling outside the test facility, the German engineers stared at the carbine lying on the table. It was not the most powerful weapon of the war. It was not the most technologically advanced. Yet for the role of fast-moving scouts, probing units, and light armored crews, it might have been the most effective weapon ever issued. They wrote their final assessment with reluctant respect. "The Americans have created a new type of weapon, one we never built, one our reconnaissance units needed, a light automatic carbine." And in this quiet moment, deep inside a collapsing Reich, the Germans realized the future had arrived in the form of a small, unassuming American firearm, hardly bigger than a child's toy.
When the German engineers finished testing the M2 Carbine in the snow-covered woods near Magdeburg, they carried the weapon back into their underground workshop with an uneasy silence. The performance alone had surprised them, but what came next shook them far more deeply. They began disassembling the rifle again, not to study its battlefield characteristics,
but to understand how it could be manufactured in such enormous numbers. Germany had struggled for years with the industrial burden of producing the STG-44. It was a revolutionary design, but every part carried the weight of German engineering tradition. The stamped receiver required specialized machines. The barrel needed high-grade steel that Germany lacked by 1944. The fire control system was intricate. The magazines were large, heavy, difficult to manufacture, and easily damaged. The assembly lines needed skilled machinists. The entire project demanded resources the collapsing Reich no longer possessed. Now, in their hands was the M2 Carbine, a weapon built in the millions, and the Germans realized instantly that it came from a different industrial world. The M2 was simple, not crude, not sloppy, just rational, functional, designed with mass production at its core. The receiver was straightforward to machine. The gas piston system used minimal parts. The fire control group was stamped and milled with remarkable economy. The stock required no exotic wood, no rare steel, no specialized tools. The entire rifle could be built by companies that had never produced weapons before, and that was exactly what America had done. The engineers unfolded reports captured earlier in the war, listing the factories producing carbines. Many names were not gun makers at all. Typewriter companies, car manufacturers, furniture producers, electronics firms, small machine shops. America had spread production across dozens of civilian industries, turning the carbine into a national manufacturing effort rather than a single military program. A German engineer stared at the list in disbelief. He murmured, "They have turned their whole country into an armory." The contrast with German industry was painful. Germany's weapons programs were centralized, rigid, and strained by shortages. Skilled labor was disappearing to the front. Factories were bombed weekly. Steel allocations were shrinking. The STG-44, as impressive as it was, could never be produced in numbers that matched German needs. Even at peak output, the Reich produced fewer than 500,000 of them. The American Carbine program produced more than 6 million. The weapons office quickly realized that the M2 Carbine did not merely fill a tactical niche. Its true strength lay in the fact that it could be delivered everywhere, to anyone, with minimal training and almost no logistical burden. That kind of weapon was the hallmark of the industrial superpower Germany had always feared the United States might become. And in 1945, that fear had come true. The German engineers turned their attention to the materials inside the rifle. The carbine required only moderate-grade steel. The barrel steel was common. The small, stamped parts used inexpensive alloys. The wooden stock could be made from several types of hardwood. The action tolerated slight manufacturing variations, something that precision-obsessed German gunmakers could not accept in their own weapons. One engineer tapped the receiver with a finger and said bitterly, "They designed it to be built by anyone. We designed ours to be built perfectly." That statement captured the industrial divide between the two nations. German engineering prized perfection. American engineering prized scale, practicality, and adaptability. The M2 represented the American way of war just as clearly as the STG-44 represented the German one. The battle was not between two rifles, but between two philosophies, and America's philosophy had proven far more sustainable. As they continued their study, the Germans discovered something even more unsettling. The full auto upgrade from M1 to M2 required almost no change in factories. The new parts were minimal. The selector mechanism was simple. The Americans had created an automatic weapon by evolving a rifle already being produced by the millions. No complex redesign, no overhaul, no special production line. With a few added components, an entire new class of weapon had emerged. One Waffenamt officer wrote the following in his formal report. "This indicates a level of industrial flexibility we cannot match. If America desires it, they could produce 2 million of these automatic carbines in a year. We could not do this even with peacetime resources." Other officers compared the carbine's industrial load to that of the STG-44. They marked down the number of machining operations, tooling requirements, and heat treatment steps. The STG-44 required dozens more. The M2 required fewer than half. It was a shock so severe that one senior designer quietly set his papers down and walked out of the room. The truth was undeniable. America had solved the mobility and firepower gap not with a radical new weapon, but with mass production.
Germany had pushed engineering to its limit and created the STG-44. America had expanded manufacturing to its limit and created the M2. In the collapsing world of 1945, only one of those approaches could survive. The Germans concluded the report with a sentence that felt like surrender. The Americans have achieved what we could never afford to achieve: a light automatic carbine for an entire army. Outside, artillery thundered nearer each day. The Reich was dying. But inside the weapons laboratory, German engineers knew they were witnessing the birth of a new age of infantry firepower, an age they would not be the first to enter.
When the Third Reich finally collapsed in the spring of 1945, the German engineers who had studied the M2 Carbine scattered into captivity, ruins, or obscurity. But their handwritten notes, their laboratory sketches, and their shocked field reports survived in Allied archives long after the war ended. These documents reveal a truth far larger than the weapon itself. The M2 Carbine was more than a simple upgrade to a light rifle. It was the opening step in an entirely new direction for American infantry weapons, a direction the Germans recognized even if the Americans had not yet fully realized it. In the quiet days after Germany's surrender, American ordnance officers read through the captured reports with growing interest. German evaluators had described the M2 with phrases that Americans themselves had never used: light assault weapon, reconnaissance automatic rifle, a hybrid class, a future concept. While the United States never thought of the M2 as an assault rifle in the German sense, the captured analyses made one thing undeniable: the M2 had entered the same conceptual world that produced the STG-44. Only the approach was different. The Americans had stumbled into a new category by accident, not by doctrine. The M2 did not use an intermediate cartridge. It did not intend to replace the service rifle. It was not created to reshape infantry tactics, yet it did reshape tactics, subtly, progressively, and across thousands of small unit engagements. Troops armed with the M2 fought differently. They moved faster. They reacted quicker. They fired more willingly. They adapted to fluid terrain. They treated the battlefield as a shifting landscape rather than a fixed line. Modern historians often call this the first American assault-type rifle, not because it matched the STG-44 in power, but because it matched the philosophy of rapid, mobile firepower for ordinary soldiers. This was the seed that would eventually grow into the post-war weapons of the United States. First, the heavier battle rifles like the M14, and then the true lightweight automatic carbine concept that culminated in the M16. All of these later designs, consciously or not, carried the echoes of what began with the M2. But perhaps the most striking impact of the M2 Carbine came not in America's arsenal, but across the world in the hands of the nations rebuilding themselves after the war. American aid programs provided thousands of carbines to allies and occupied countries. South Korean forces used them heavily during the Korean War, where the lightweight and fast handling proved invaluable in mountainous terrain. French troops carried them in Indochina and Algeria. Filipino soldiers used them against insurgents. Taiwanese troops trained with them. West German police carried them in the uncertain early years of the Cold War. In South Vietnam, the carbine became one of the most familiar rifles in the countryside during the early 1960s. Everywhere it went, the M2 was valued for the same reasons that had shocked German engineers in 1945. It was fast, it was simple, it was reliable, it delivered automatic fire without the burden of weight. It was the kind of weapon soldiers learned instinctively, and it proved that modern infantry did not need to carry heavy wood and steel relics from the past to fight effectively. They needed speed, they needed volume, they needed a tool that matched the reality of modern battlefields. Even decades later, the idea of the light automatic carbine would dominate military thinking. The PDWs of the late 20th century, the compact carbines of special operations forces, and even the civilian defensive rifles of the modern era all trace some part of their identity to the same philosophy the M2 embodied. A weapon that fills the space between pistol and rifle. A weapon that turns mobility into firepower. A weapon that anyone can carry, not only elite troops. Looking back through the lens of history,
The M2 Carbine stands as a reminder of the strange way innovation often occurs. Germany created the Sturmgewehr through deliberate engineering genius. The United States created the M2 Carbine almost as an afterthought, a natural evolution of a rifle built for mass issue. Yet both weapons pointed toward the same future. Only one was built in industrial quantities large enough to shape the war. That was the lesson the German engineers wrote in their final captured report. They have created a new class of weapon. Not an SMG, not a rifle. Something in between. Something we needed but never built. If anything, this single sentence captures the M2's legacy better than any American document ever could. It was not the loudest weapon of the war. It was not the most famous. It never gained the mythic reputation of the STG-44 or the Garand. But it was arguably the most forward-looking. It showed that the path to future infantry weapons lay neither in heavy battle rifles nor in slow submachine guns, but in something lighter, faster, and more adaptive. In the dying months of the war, as German engineers stood in bomb-lit laboratories and recognized the significance of the weapon in their hands, they unknowingly predicted the next half-century of infantry design. The M2 Carbine was not just a captured trophy, it was a glimpse of the future. And though the war ended, the idea behind it did not. It continued to shape armies, doctrines, and battlefields long after the rifle itself had faded from American service. The legacy of the M2 was not the steel it was made from, but the concept it introduced. A concept that Germans understood too late. A concept that would define the modern soldier.